The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of San Pedro, California, just as Julia Vane reached for the handle of Dr. Hendrick's office door, and she spun around to see a man collapse in the middle of the road, crimson already blooming across his shoulder like a desert wildflower after rain. It was August of 1878, and San Pedro had grown from a small fishing village into a bustling port town where cattle met commerce, where cowboys drove herds down from the inland ranges to meet the ships that would carry beef to San Francisco and beyond. Julia had arrived only 3 months prior, fleeing memories of Philadelphia and a broken engagement that still stung when she let herself remember it. The position as Dr. Hendrick's assistant had been her salvation, a chance to start over where nobody knew her story. She dropped her basket of fresh bandages and rushed toward the fallen man, her practical gray skirt kicking up dust as her boots pounded the packed earth. Other townsfolk were emerging from buildings, curious and cautious, but Julia had assisted Dr. Hendricks long enough to know that hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. The cowboy lay on his back, one hand pressed to his shoulder, his jaw clenched tight against the pain. He was young, probably not much older than her own 22 years, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled at the ends where it touched his collar. Blood seeped between his fingers and his eyes, a striking shade of green against his tanned face, fixed on her as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Easy now," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I am Dr. Hendrick's assistant. Let me see." "The other fellow," the cowboy managed through gritted teeth. "He got away." Julia glanced around. She could see no sign of whoever had fired the shot, only townspeople gathering at a safe distance. "Do not worry about that now. Can you tell me your name, Xander?" "Xander Jameson." He winced as she gently moved his hand to examine the wound. "And I am worried because he took my horse. That was a good horse." Despite the gravity of the situation, Julia found herself almost wanting to laugh at his priorities. "Well, Mr. Jameson, if you want to live long enough to get another horse, you need to let me help you. The bullet went through. That is good, but we need to get you inside before you bleed out in the street." "You are direct," he said, and there was something in his eyes, a spark of humor even through the pain that made her stomach flip in an unexpected way. "I am practical," she corrected, already tearing a strip from her petticoat to create a makeshift bandage. "Now, can you stand if I help you?" 2 men from the crowd came forward, a shopkeeper named Martin and a dock worker called Pete, and together they helped Xander to his feet. He swayed slightly, his face going pale beneath the tan, but he stayed conscious as they half carried him into the doctor's office. Dr. Hendricks emerged from the back room, his gray beard and wire-rimmed spectacles giving him the appearance of a kindly professor rather than a frontier physician. He had been a battlefield surgeon during the war, though, and his hands were as steady as they had been 15 years prior, when he had sewn up boys barely old enough to shave. "On the table," he directed, and they laid Xander down on the examination table that dominated the center of the room. Julia was already pumping water into the basin, scrubbing her hands the way the doctor had taught her, preparing instruments. "Julia, I will need you to hold him steady," Dr. Hendricks said, peering at the wound with practiced eyes. "The bullet went through cleanly, but there may be fabric in there. I need to clean it thoroughly." She moved to Xander's uninjured side, placing her hands firmly on his good shoulder and his chest. Through his shirt, she could feel the rapid beating of his heart, the heat of his skin. His eyes found hers again, and she saw fear there now, mixed with determination. "This is going to hurt," the doctor warned. "I have been hurt before," Xander said, but his voice was tighter than before. Julia found herself speaking without thinking, her voice low and meant only for him. "Look at me. Just keep looking at me and breathe, in and out. That is all you need to do right now." His eyes locked onto hers, green as spring grass in a land that showed precious little green this time of year. Dr. Hendricks began cleaning the wound, and she felt Xander's body go rigid beneath her hands. His jaw clenched so hard she thought his teeth might crack, but he did not cry out. He just kept breathing, kept looking at her, and she kept talking, saying things she could not even later remember, just a steady stream of words meant to give him something to hold onto besides the pain. When it was finally over, when the wound had been cleaned and packed with carbolic-soaked gauze and bandaged properly, Xander's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his face was the color of old parchment, but he managed a weak smile. "Thank you," he whispered. "Save your strength," Dr. Hendricks said. "You have lost a good amount of blood. You will need to stay here for a few days so we can watch for infection." "I cannot afford days in a sick bed," Xander protested, trying to sit up. "I have a job. I am supposed to help drive a herd north in 3 days." "Then I suppose you will miss it," Julia said firmly, pressing him back down with surprising strength. "Because if you try to sit a horse right now, you will either pass out and fall off, or you will tear open this wound and bleed to death. Are either of those outcomes preferable to missing one cattle drive?" He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a long breath. "You really are direct. I told you, I am practical." She pulled a blanket over him. "Now rest. We have a cot in the back room where you can sleep properly once you are steady enough to move." Over the next hour, as Xander's color slowly returned and his heartbeat settled into a more normal rhythm, Julia learned more about him in bits and pieces. He had been in San Pedro for 2 weeks, working odd jobs while waiting for the cattle drive north. He had no family to speak of, his parents having died when he was 16, leaving him to make his own way in the world. He had been shot by a man he had never seen before, someone who had simply ridden up, demanded his horse, and fired when Xander had refused. "It was a good horse," he said again, and Julia found herself smiling despite herself. "You mentioned that. A paint mare. Smartest horse I ever had. Trained her myself from a filly." His eyes drifted closed. "Probably halfway to Mexico by now. Or the sheriff might recover her," Julia suggested, though she knew the chances were slim. Horse thieves were common in these parts and they moved fast. "Maybe," Xander murmured, but he did not sound hopeful. By evening, they had moved him to the back room where Dr. Hendricks kept a cot for patients who needed extended care. It was not much, just a small room with the cot, a chair, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, but it was clean and quiet. Julia brought him broth that evening, insisting he eat even though he claimed he was not hungry. "You lost blood. You need to rebuild your strength. Eat." "Yes, madam," he said with a hint of amusement that irritated and pleased her in equal measure. She sat in the chair while he ate, ostensibly to make sure he finished the broth, but really because she found herself curious about him. There was something about Xander Jameson that drew her attention, something beyond his striking eyes or the way he had borne pain without complaint. "What brought you to San Pedro?" she asked. He finished the broth before answering, handing her back the bowl. "Work. Same as it brings most folks to most places. I have been drifting since I left Colorado. Worked ranches, did some mining, tried my hand at just about everything. Figured I might like it near the ocean for a change. And do you like it, I mean?" He considered this. "Have not seen much of it yet beyond the docks, but I like the smell of the salt air. It is different from the dust and sage I am used to." "I know what you mean," Julia said softly. "I came from Philadelphia. The ocean here is different from the Atlantic, but there is something about being near water that feels like possibility. Running from something." He asked it gently, without judgment, and she found herself answering honestly. Someone. A man I was engaged to marry. He decided 2 months before the wedding that he preferred my younger sister. She had not meant to say it, had not told anyone in San Pedro the real reason she had left the East, but the words came out before she could stop them. He was a fool, Xander said simply. Or she was prettier, Julia replied with a shrug that she hoped looked careless. Either way, I have no desire to return. I like my work here. Dr. Hendricks is a good teacher, and I am learning more than I ever could have back home. Still, Xander said, his eyes serious, any man who would choose between sisters like that is not worth mourning. Something in his words, in the straightforward honesty of them, loosened a knot in her chest that had been there for months. Thank you for saying that. I am just stating facts, madam, Julia, she corrected. If I am going to be changing your bandages and bringing you meals for the next few days, we might as well use first names. Julia, he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his voice, rough around the edges but warm. Then you should call me Xander. I know, you told me when you were bleeding in the street. Did I? He looked surprised. I do not remember much of that except your eyes. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and stood quickly, taking the empty bowl. You should rest now. I will check on you in a few hours. Julia, he called as she reached the door. She turned back. Yes, thank you for helping me, for saving my life, really. It is what I do, she said, but her voice was softer than she intended. Sleep now. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm. Julia would check on Xander first thing in the morning, changing his bandages and checking for signs of infection. Dr. Hendricks had taught her well, and she was relieved to see that the wound was healing cleanly. No red streaks radiating out from it, no fever developing. Xander was young and strong, and his body was doing what it should. But those morning visits began to stretch longer than medically necessary. Xander was easy to talk to, and Julia found herself sharing things she had not expected to share. She told him about her life in Philadelphia, about her father who had been a banker and her mother who had prized social standing above all else. She told him about how she had always been drawn to medicine, how she had volunteered at a hospital during an outbreak of influenza, and discovered that she had both the stomach and the aptitude for healing work. My mother was horrified, Julia said, sitting in the chair beside his cot on the second morning while she waited for the carbolic solution to finish soaking into the fresh bandages. She said it was not suitable work for a lady, that I was ruining my hands and my reputation, but I did not care. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. It does matter, Xander said. He was sitting up now, bare-chested while she worked on his shoulder, and she tried not to notice the lean muscle of his torso, the way his skin was lighter where his shirt usually covered. You saved my life. I would say that matters quite a bit. Dr. Hendricks did most of the work, she demurred. But you were the one who got to me first. You were the one who kept me calm while he worked. I remember that, even through the pain. Your voice, your eyes, the way you told me to just keep breathing. He paused, then added quietly, it helped more than you know. She focused on wrapping the fresh bandage around his shoulder, her fingers steady despite the flutter in her chest. I am glad. Xander told her about his life too. He talked about growing up on a small ranch in Colorado, about his father teaching him to ride before he could properly walk, about his mother who had sung while she worked and made the best apple pie in the territory. He talked about losing them both to cholera when he was 16, about selling the ranch because he could not bear to stay there alone with their ghosts. I have been moving ever since, he said, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I tell myself I am looking for the right place, but maybe I am just running too. From what? Julia asked, beginning to button his clean shirt for him since his shoulder was still too stiff for him to manage easily. From standing still long enough to feel lonely, I suppose. He caught her hand as she finished with the last button, his fingers warm around hers. Until now, anyway. She should have pulled her hand away. It was improper, and Dr. Hendricks could come in at any moment, but she did not. She let her hand rest in his, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. "Xander," she said softly, not sure what she meant to say next. The door opened, and she jerked her hand back as Dr. Hendricks entered with his medical bag. If he noticed anything amiss, he was kind enough not to mention it. "How is our patient this morning?" he asked cheerfully. "Healing well," Julia said, her voice perhaps a bit too bright. "No sign of infection, and the wound is closing nicely." "Excellent, excellent." Dr. Hendricks examined Xander's shoulder himself, nodding with satisfaction. "You have been lucky, young man, and you have had an excellent nurse." "I know," Xander said, his eyes finding Julia's. "I have been very lucky." On the third day, Xander was strong enough to walk around the room, though Dr. Hendricks insisted he was not yet ready to leave. Julia brought him lunch, a plate of beef and beans from the boarding house down the street, and sat with him while he ate. "I have been thinking," Xander said between bites, "about what I am going to do when I leave here." "You need to rest for at least another week before you should even think about working," Julia said automatically. "I know, but after that." He set down his fork, looking at her seriously. "The cattle drive is long gone, and my horses too. I have about $20 to my name and no prospects. I should probably move on, try to find work somewhere else." Something cold settled in Julia's stomach at the thought of him leaving, which was ridiculous. She had known him for 3 days. He was a patient, nothing more. Except that was a lie, and she knew it. He was becoming something more, had been from the moment their eyes met in the street. "Or," Xander continued, his voice careful, "I could stay in San Pedro, find work here. There is always need for ranch hands at the cattle operations inland, or I could work at the docks. I am strong, and I am a hard worker." "Why would you stay?" Julia asked, her heart beating faster. "You said yourself you never stay anywhere for long. Maybe I found a reason to break that pattern." His eyes held hers. "Maybe I would like to get to know the woman who saved my life a bit better, if she would like that too." Julia knew she should be cautious. She had come to California to escape heartbreak, not to court it again. She knew nothing about Xander Jameson beyond what he had told her, had no way to verify his character beyond her own instincts. But those instincts, the same ones that had drawn her to healing work, that had told her to leave Philadelphia and start over, were telling her now that this man was worth the risk. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise over the ocean, bright and full of promise. That evening, after Dr. Hendricks had gone home for the night, Julia sat with Xander in his small room. It was improper, she knew, but somehow the normal rules felt suspended in this space. He was sitting up on the cot, his back against the wall, and she sat in the chair pulled close beside him. They talked about everything and nothing, their words weaving together in the lamplight. "What made you want to be a doctor's assistant?" Xander asked. "I know you said you volunteered during the influenza outbreak, but what drew you to it in the first place?" Julia thought about it, trying to put into words something she had never fully articulated even to herself. "I suppose I wanted to feel useful. My whole life in Philadelphia was about appearances. The right dress, the right parties, the right marriage. Everything was about how things looked, never about what they meant. But medicine is different. Either you help someone or you do not. Either they heal or they do not. There is something honest about it, something real that I never found in society parlors." "I understand that," Xander said. It is like working with horses or cattle. They do not care about appearances. They care about whether you are patient, whether you are steady, whether you know what you are doing. Exactly. She smiled at him, pleased that he understood. What about you? If you could do anything, what would you want? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. I used to think I just wanted to keep moving, keep seeing new places. But lately, the last year or so, I have found myself wanting something different. A place to belong. Maybe a ranch of my own someday, nothing big, just enough land to run a small herd. A house that is actually home, not just another boarding house or bunkhouse. He paused, then added quietly, someone to share it with. That sounds nice, Julia said, her throat tight. It does it not? He looked at her then, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Julia, I know we have only known each other for 3 days. I know I have no right to say this, and you can tell me to keep my peace if you want. But I need you to know that I have never felt this way before. Not with anyone. There is something about you that makes me want to stop running. Makes me want to stay still for the first time in 6 years. She should tell him it was too soon, that they needed more time. But her heart was pounding, and the words that came out were not cautious at all. I feel it too, this pull toward you. It terrifies me because the last time I trusted my heart, it was shattered. But with you, it feels different. It feels right. He reached out with his good arm, his hand cupping her cheek. I cannot promise I will never hurt you. I cannot predict the future. But I can promise that I will try every day to be worthy of your trust, if you are willing to give me the chance. I am willing, she whispered. And then he was leaning forward and she was meeting him halfway, and their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. I think this is highly improper, Julia said, kissing a patient. I think you are right, Xander agreed, not looking the least bit sorry. Absolutely scandalous. Dr. Hendricks would be shocked, appalled. We should definitely not do it again. Definitely not, Xander said, and then they were both laughing and he was kissing her again, deeper this time, his hand sliding into her hair to pull her closer. A week later, Xander was well enough to leave the doctor's office. His shoulder was still healing, still stiff and sometimes painful, but the danger of infection had passed. Dr. Hendricks declared him fit to return to light work, though he cautioned against anything strenuous for at least another month. You have been an excellent patient, the doctor said as Xander settled his hat on his head, preparing to step out into the San Pedro sunshine. And I am pleased to say you have made a full recovery. Thanks to you and Julia, Xander said. He had found work at one of the cattle ranches outside town, doing mostly light work like mending fences and tending horses. The pay was not great, but it was enough for him to rent a small room above the general store and still have a bit left over. More importantly, it kept him in San Pedro. Over the following weeks, Julia and Xander fell into a pattern of courtship that felt both exhilaratingly new and comfortably familiar. He would come into town every Sunday, his one day off, and they would spend the day together. Sometimes they would walk along the docks, watching the ships come in and out. Sometimes they would ride out into the hills, Julia sitting side saddle on a borrowed mare while Xander rode a gelding from the ranch, and they would find a spot overlooking the ocean to share a picnic lunch. They talked endlessly, learning each other's stories, their dreams and fears and memories. Julia learned that Xander had a scar on his left knee from falling out of a tree at age 8, that he could not carry a tune to save his life but loved to hear music, that he had a deep fear of fire after seeing a barn burn when he was a child. Xander learned that Julia could speak French, that she was terrified of spiders but completely unafraid of blood, that she cried at sad songs but never at her own misfortunes. I think, Xander said one Sunday afternoon as they sat on a grassy hillside overlooking the ocean. "That you are the strongest person I have ever met." Julia laughed. "I am not strong. I ran away from my problems in Philadelphia rather than facing them." "That is not running away. That is choosing yourself over a situation that was making you miserable. That takes strength." He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You started over in a place where you knew no one, built a new life doing work you love. That is incredibly brave." "When you put it that way, maybe it is," she admitted. The ocean stretched out before them, endless and blue, and she thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment, this hillside, this man. "I am glad I came here. I am glad you got shot." "That is a strange thing to be glad about," Xander said, laughing. "Well, I am not glad you were hurt," Julia clarified, "but I am glad it brought you into my life." He turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious. "Julia, I know we have only been courting for a few weeks. I know that by all reasonable standards we should take more time, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you." Her heart seemed to stop and then start again, beating double time. "Xander." "You do not have to say it back," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. I love you. Your strength, your kindness, your practical nature, and the way you say exactly what you mean. The way you look at the world like it is full of problems to be solved rather than obstacles to be feared. The way you saved my life and then changed it completely. You healed more than just your wounds," Julia said softly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her. "You healed something in me I did not even know was broken. That faith in myself, in my judgment, that my sister and my former fiancé shattered. You made me believe again that I could trust my heart." "And what is your heart telling you?" Xander asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "That I love you too," she said, and watched joy bloom across his face like dawn. "I love you, Xander Jameson, with your stories and your lost horse and your dreams of a ranch. I love you." He kissed her then, deep and long, and the ocean wind whipped around them, carrying the salt smell and the cry of gulls, and Julia thought that she had never been so perfectly happy in all her life. As autumn came to San Pedro, bringing cooler temperatures and the occasional rain that turned the hills briefly green, Julia and Xander's relationship deepened. They began talking seriously about the future, about marriage and what their life together might look like. "I have been saving every penny I can," Xander told her one evening. They were sitting on the porch of Dr. Hendrick's office, watching the sun set over the ocean. "I have nearly $100 now. It is not much, but it is a start." "A start toward what?" Julia asked, though she thought she knew. "A place of our own. Nothing fancy, just a small house on enough land to run a few head of cattle, maybe some horses. I have been talking to a man who owns a big spread north of here, up in the hills. He is getting old, thinking about selling off parcels of his land. I could afford maybe 10 acres if I save for another 6 months." "That sounds wonderful," Julia said. "And I have money saved too from my work with Dr. Hendricks. Not much, but enough to help." Xander shook his head. "I cannot take your money." "It is not about taking," Julia said firmly. "It is about building something together. If we are going to marry, then we are partners. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "When did you get so wise?" "I have always been wise," she said loftily. "You are just now noticing." But there was a complication, one that neither of them had fully addressed. Julia loved her work with Dr. Hendricks. Over the past 6 months she had learned so much, had helped so many people. The thought of giving it up, of being just a rancher's wife cooking and cleaning while Xander worked the land, made something in her chest tighten with panic. Xander noticed her sudden silence. "What is wrong?" "Nothing," she said, then corrected herself. No, that is not true. Xander, I love the idea of a ranch, of building a life with you, but I do not want to give up my work. Medicine is important to me. Helping people is important to me. I know that, he said slowly. But if we move north into the hills, I will be hours from town. How can I assist Dr. Hendricks if I am that far away? And if we have children, I will be even busier. I do not want to lose this part of myself. Xander was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "What if the ranch was close enough to town that you could still work?" It would be more expensive. Land closer to San Pedro costs more. But if we saved for longer, maybe a year instead of 6 months, we could afford it. You would do that? Julia asked. Wait longer for your dream so I could keep mine. Julia, my dream is not a ranch. My dream is a life with you, whatever form that takes. If that means waiting longer to buy land so you can keep working, then that is what we will do. If it means living in town and having no land at all, that is fine too. You are what matters to me. Everything else is just details. She kissed him then, there on the porch where anyone walking by could see, and she did not care. Have I mentioned that I love you? Once or twice, he said, grinning, but I do not mind hearing it again. The conversation with Dr. Hendricks happened the next morning. Julia had been nervous about it, unsure how he would react to news of her courtship and potential marriage. The doctor had been kind to her, had taken a chance on hiring a woman with no formal training, and she did not want to disappoint him. But Dr. Hendricks surprised her. "My dear girl," he said, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "Did you think I had not noticed? The way you smile when Mr. Jameson comes to town, the way you rush through your afternoon work on Saturdays so you can have Sunday free. I may be old, but I am not blind." Julia felt her cheeks heat. "I am sorry, doctor, I should have told you." "Nonsense. Your personal life is your own business. I am simply happy to see you happy. That young man looks at you like you hang the stars, and unless I am very much mistaken, you look at him the same way." "I do," Julia admitted. "We are talking about marriage, but Dr. Hendricks, I do not want to leave my position here. I know that is not traditional, and I know it may cause talk, but this work means everything to me." The doctor nodded slowly. "I understand. And I must tell you, Julia, that you have been the best assistant I have ever had. You have a true gift for medicine, a natural aptitude that cannot be taught. It would be a waste for you to give that up. So you would want me to stay on, even after I marry, if you wish to, absolutely. Though I must warn you, there will be some in town who disapprove. There are still those who believe a woman's place is solely in the home, especially a married woman." "Let them disapprove," Julia said with more confidence than she felt. "I am tired of living my life according to other people's expectations." "That is the spirit," Dr. Hendricks said, smiling. "Now, shall we discuss your salary? If you are going to be saving for a ranch, I imagine every penny counts." Over the next months, Julia and Xander saved diligently. He took extra work when he could, hiring himself out on his days off to help with cattle roundups or building projects. Julia asked Dr. Hendricks if there was any additional work she could take on, and he began teaching her more advanced techniques, allowing her to take on more responsibility and earn more as a result. By the time spring arrived in 1879, painting the California hills with wildflowers, they had saved nearly $300 between them. It was enough, they learned, to purchase 15 acres about an hour's ride north of San Pedro, with a small cabin already built on it and a creek running through the property. "It is perfect," Julia breathed when they first rode out to see it. The cabin was rough, just 2 rooms and in need of repair, but it was sturdy. The land rolled gently, good for grazing, and the creek meant reliable water for livestock. She could imagine it so clearly. A few head of cattle, chickens, maybe a vegetable garden. And more than that, she could imagine a life here with Xander, building something together. "We could fix it up," Xander said, his arm around her waist as they stood looking at the property. "Add another room or two as we need them. Build a barn. It would take work, but we could make it into something really special." "When can we buy it?" Julia asked, turning to look at him. "Well," Xander said slowly, "I suppose I should ask you to marry me first, properly, I mean. I know we have talked about it, but I have not actually asked." He took a step back, then dropped to one knee right there in the California sunshine, taking her hand in his. "Julia Vane, you are the smartest, most stubborn, most wonderful woman I have ever known. You saved my life in more ways than one, and I cannot imagine spending a single day without you. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Julia said, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married in June of 1879 in a simple ceremony at the small church in San Pedro. Julia wore a dress of cream-colored silk, simple and elegant, and carried wildflowers picked from their new property. Xander wore his best shirt and a new pair of trousers, his dark hair neatly combed for once, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. Dr. Hendricks gave her away, having become something of a father figure to her over the past year. The church was full of people from the town, patients Julia had helped, friends they had made. Even the rancher Xander worked for came, along with several of the other ranch hands. "I, Xander Jameson, take you, Julia Elizabeth Vane, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Xander said, his voice strong and clear. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. I, Julia Elizabeth Vane, take you, Xander Jameson, to be my lawfully wedded husband," Julia repeated, her hands clasped in his. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her with such tenderness that Julia felt her heart might burst with happiness. This was nothing like her first engagement, with its stiff formality and social obligations. This was real, a true partnership built on love and respect and shared dreams. They spent their wedding night in the cabin on their new property, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the sound of the creek outside. Xander carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the center of what would be their home. "We did it," he said wonderingly. "We actually did it." "Did you doubt?" Julia asked, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Not for a moment," he said, and kissed her. That night, as they lay together as husband and wife for the first time, Julia felt a completeness she had never known before. This was what had been missing in Philadelphia, this sense of being wholly herself with another person, of being loved not despite her unconventional dreams but because of them. "What are you thinking?" Xander murmured, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "That I am happy," Julia said simply. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Me too," he said, "though I have to admit I am a bit terrified." "Of what?" "Of all the ways I might disappoint you, of not being enough." Julia propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him seriously. "Xander Jameson, you listen to me. You are more than enough. You are everything I need and things I did not even know I wanted. We are going to make mistakes, both of us. We are going to argue and frustrate each other and have days where nothing goes right. But we are in this together, and that means we will figure it out together." "How did I get so lucky?" he asked, pulling her down for another kiss. "I shot you," she pointed out. "Someone shot me and you fixed it. Not quite the same thing." "Close enough," she said. And then they were both laughing again. and Julia thought that laughter was just as important as passion, that being able to find joy together would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The first year of marriage was harder than either of them had anticipated, but it was also deeply rewarding. They worked together to fix up the cabin, adding a third room that would eventually be a nursery, patching the roof, replacing windows. Xander built a barn with help from some of the men he had worked with at the ranch, and they bought their first cattle, just 5 head to start with, and a small flock of chickens. Julia continued her work with Dr. Hendricks, riding into San Pedro 3 days a week. It was exhausting, managing both the ranch work and her medical duties, but she had never felt more alive. She helped birth babies and set broken bones and treated fevers, and then she would ride home to help Xander with the evening chores, to cook dinner over their hearth, to fall into bed exhausted but satisfied. "You are going to work yourself to death," Xander said one evening after she had nearly fallen asleep in her dinner plate. "Maybe you should cut back on your hours with the doctor." "I am fine," Julia insisted, though she knew he was right. She was constantly tired, running from task to task with barely a moment to breathe. "Julia, please. I know your work is important to you, but I am worried about you. You look exhausted all the time." "What would you have me do?" she asked, and heard the edge in her voice. "Give up medicine entirely. Become just a rancher's wife." "That is not what I said." "But it is what you meant." They stared at each other across the table, tension crackling between them. It was their first real fight, and Julia hated it, hated the distance that suddenly yawned between them. But Xander took a deep breath and reached across the table for her hand. "No, it is not what I meant. I am sorry if it came out that way. I do not want you to give up anything. I just want to find a way for you to have everything you want without exhausting yourself in the process. Maybe you could work with Dr. Hendricks just 2 days a week instead of 3. Or maybe we need to hire help here at the ranch so you are not trying to do everything." Julia felt the anger drain out of her. "I am sorry too. I am just so afraid of having to choose between the work I love and the life I love. I do not want to give up either." "Then we will figure out how to make both work," Xander said firmly. "That is what marriage is, right? Figuring things out together." They talked long into the night, working out a compromise. Julia would cut back to 2 days a week with Dr. Hendricks, at least for now. They would use some of their savings to hire a local teenager to help with the ranch chores a few days a week. It was not a perfect solution, but it was workable, and more importantly, they had come to it together. "I love you," Julia said as they finally climbed into bed well after midnight. "Even when we fight." "Especially when we fight," Xander said. "It means we care enough to work things out rather than just walking away." As the months passed, they found their rhythm as a couple, learning how to navigate the complexities of building a life together. The ranch slowly prospered. Their small herd grew to 15 head of cattle, and they added a pair of horses. Xander was building a reputation as someone who could work with difficult horses, and people began bringing him animals to train. Julia's work with Dr. Hendricks evolved too. She began taking on more responsibility, and the doctor started introducing her to patients as my associate rather than just his assistant. There were still those in town who disapproved of a married woman working, who whispered behind their hands when she passed, but there were others who sought her out specifically, who trusted her skill and appreciated her straightforward manner. In the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after their first meeting, Julia realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the familiar signs impossible to ignore with her medical knowledge, but she had waited to be sure before telling Xander. She chose a Sunday evening after they had finished dinner and were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "I have something to tell you," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. That sounds ominous, Xander said, but he was smiling. Not ominous, just important. She took his hand, placing it on her still flat stomach. We are going to have a baby. In October, I think. For a moment, Xander just stared at her, his eyes wide. Then he let out a whoop of joy so loud it startled the chickens, scooping her up and spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. Careful, she protested. I will be sick. He set her down gently, immediately contrite. I am sorry, are you all right? Do you feel sick? Should you be sitting down? I am fine, Julia said, amused. I am pregnant, not made of glass. Women have been doing this since the dawn of time. But you are my wife, Xander said, his hands cupping her face. You are carrying our child. That is different. She knew what he meant. It was one thing to know intellectually that pregnancy was a natural process, another entirely when it was happening to someone you loved. I will be careful, she promised, but I am not going to stop living my life. I am young and healthy. Most likely, everything will be fine. Most likely. Xander latched onto the words. But not definitely, Julia sighed. She had not wanted to frighten him, but he deserved honesty. Childbirth always carries risks. You know that. But I am in the best possible position to manage those risks. I know what to watch for, and Dr. Hendricks will be there to help when the time comes. I am terrified, Xander admitted. So am I, Julia said softly. But I am also excited. We are going to be parents, Xander. We are going to bring a new life into this world, a child who is part both of us. That is incredible. He pulled her close, his arms around her, and she felt him trembling slightly. I am going to be the best father I can be, he whispered into her hair. I promise you that. I know you will, Julia said, and I am going to be the best mother I can be. Together, we are going to give this child a wonderful life. The pregnancy progressed normally at first. Julia continued working with Dr. Hendricks for the first few months, though she let him take on the more strenuous cases. At home, Xander hovered constantly, insisting on doing any task that required lifting or bending, bringing her water and making sure she was resting enough. I am pregnant, not dying, Julia said for what felt like the 100th time, but she was touched by his care, even when it was excessive. As summer arrived and her belly swelled, Julia finally had to admit that she could no longer make the ride into San Pedro comfortably. She talked to Dr. Hendricks, and they came to an agreement that she would take a break from her work until after the baby was born and she had recovered. You will always have a position with me, Dr. Hendricks assured her. Take whatever time you need. It felt strange, being at the ranch full time. Julia had never been someone who enjoyed idleness, and there were only so many baby clothes she could sew, only so much preserving and canning she could do. But she found satisfaction in preparing their home for the new arrival, in transforming the third room into a proper nursery with a cradle Xander built from wood he had carefully selected and sanded smooth. What do you think? He asked, showing her the finished cradle. It was beautiful, simple but sturdy, with delicate carvings of horses along the sides. It is perfect, Julia said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Our baby is very lucky to have you as a father. August brought blistering heat, and Julia grew increasingly uncomfortable. Her back ached constantly, her ankles swelled, and she could barely sleep. Xander did everything he could to help, fanning her in the evening heat, rubbing her feet, fetching her whatever food she craved at odd hours. I feel enormous, Julia complained one evening as she tried and failed to find a comfortable position. You are beautiful, Xander said loyally. I am a whale, a very beautiful whale. Despite her discomfort, Julia laughed. You are terrible at this. At what? Complimenting my wife. At lying, but I appreciate the effort. She took his hand, guiding it to her belly. Feel that, the baby is kicking. Xander's face lit up with wonder as he felt the movements beneath his palm. That is incredible. Our child is in there, alive and growing. And apparently training to be a fighter, Julia said as a particularly strong kick landed against her ribs. I swear this baby is part mule. Takes after you then, Xander said, grinning. Excuse me. You know, stubborn, strong-willed, determined to do things your own way. Julia swatted at him, but she was smiling. And if the baby takes after you, it will be impossibly idealistic and convinced it can charm its way out of any situation. That is not a bad combination, Xander said thoughtfully. Stubborn and charming. This child is going to be unstoppable. As September arrived, Julia found herself growing increasingly nervous. She knew too much, had seen too many things go wrong during childbirth. She tried to push the fears aside, reminding herself that most births proceeded normally, but the knowledge lurked in the back of her mind. Xander noticed her growing anxiety. Talk to me, he said one evening. What are you afraid of? Everything, Julia admitted. I am afraid something will go wrong with the baby. I am afraid something will happen to me. I am afraid I will not be a good mother. I am afraid of the pain. I am just afraid. I wish I could tell you not to be, Xander said, pulling her close. But I think fear is normal. We are about to become responsible for a tiny human life. That is terrifying. But Julia, we are in this together. Whatever happens, we will face it together. Promise me something, Julia said, her voice muffled against his chest. Anything. If something goes wrong, if you have to choose between me and the baby, promise me you will choose the baby. Xander stiffened. Julia, no, please. I need to know our child will be safe. And I need you, Xander said fiercely. I cannot lose you, Julia. I will not. Do not ask me to make that promise. But the baby will need its mother, Xander finished. Julia, I am going to be selfish here. I love our baby, of course I do, but you are my world. You are the reason I stopped running, the reason I have a home and a purpose and a future. If I lost you, I would lose everything that matters, so I cannot make that promise. I will not. Julia wanted to argue, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the desperation. All right, she said softly. But nothing is going to go wrong. I am young and healthy, and Dr. Hendricks will be here to help. Everything is going to be fine. Everything is going to be fine, Xander repeated, like a prayer. The baby came early at the end of September during an unseasonably cool night. Julia woke to cramping pain, and she knew immediately what was happening. Xander, she said, shaking him awake. It is time. He was up in an instant, pulling on his clothes. I will ride to town and get Dr. Hendricks. No time, Julia gasped as another contraction hit. This baby is coming fast. You are going to have to help me. She saw a panic flash across his face, but he swallowed it down. Tell me what to do. Over the next hours, as the contractions intensified and the baby moved toward birth, Julia coached Xander through what needed to happen. He was terrified, his hands shaking, but he did everything she told him to do. He boiled water, prepared clean cloths, helped her walk when she needed to move, supported her when the contractions were too strong for her to stand alone. You are doing so well, he kept saying, his voice steady even though she could see the fear in his eyes. You are so strong, Julia. You can do this. The pain was unlike anything Julia had experienced. She had helped birth dozens of babies, had seen women go through this, but experiencing it herself was entirely different. It was consuming, overwhelming, and there were moments when she was sure she could not continue. But then she would hear Xander's voice, feel his hand in hers, and she would find the strength to keep going finally. As the first light of dawn was breaking through the window, the baby was born. Xander caught the infant with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Julia heard the most beautiful sound in the world, their baby's first cry. It is a boy, Xander said, his voice choked with emotion. "Julia, we have a son." He placed the baby on Julia's chest, and she looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." The baby had dark hair like Xander and what looked like they might be Julia's blue eyes. He was perfect, tiny and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. "We need to deliver the afterbirth," Julia said, exhaustion making her words slur. "And then we need to cut the cord and clean him up." "Tell me what to do," Xander said, and Julia guided him through the final steps. When it was over, when the baby was cleaned and wrapped in soft blankets, when Julia had been tended to and was finally lying back against pillows, Xander sat beside her, cradling their son in his arms. "What should we name him?" he asked. Julia had been thinking about this for months. "I like Thomas. Thomas Alexander Jameson." "Thomas," Xander repeated, looking down at the baby. "Hello, Thomas. I am your father and this is your mother, and we love you more than you will ever know." Thomas chose that moment to yawn, his tiny mouth opening wide, and both Julia and Xander laughed, the sound watery with tears. "We did it," Julia said wonderingly. "We have a son." "We do," Xander said. He leaned over carefully, kissing Julia softly. "Thank you. For our son, for our life, for everything." "Thank you," Julia echoed. "For being here, for helping me, for being exactly who I needed you to be." Later that morning, after Julia had managed to sleep for a few hours, and Thomas had nursed for the first time, Xander rode into San Pedro to tell Dr. Hendricks about the birth. The doctor came out to the ranch immediately, examining both Julia and the baby and declaring them healthy. "You did well," he told Xander. "Delivering a baby is no small thing, especially your first time." "Julia told me what to do," Xander said. "I was just following instructions." "Still," Dr. Hendricks said, "you kept your head in a crisis. That is commendable." As he was preparing to leave, the doctor pulled Julia aside. "How are you really feeling?" he asked quietly. "Not just physically." Julia thought about it. She was sore and exhausted, and there had been moments during the birth when she had been truly frightened. But underlying it all was a deep sense of joy and accomplishment. "I am happy," she said simply. "Happier than I have ever been." "Good," the doctor said, patting her hand. "You have built a good life here, Julia, a life you can be proud of." The first months with Thomas were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby woke every few hours to eat, and Julia felt like she was constantly tired, constantly feeding him or changing him or trying to soothe him when he cried. But there were also moments of pure magic. The first time Thomas smiled at her, the way he would quiet when Xander sang to him in his terrible off-key voice, the feel of his tiny hand wrapped around her finger. Xander was a devoted father, taking on as much of the ranch work as he could so Julia could rest and recover. He would come in from morning chores to find her dozing with Thomas on her chest, and he would carefully take the baby so she could sleep more deeply. He changed diapers and walked the floor with Thomas at night and looked at his son with such love that it made Julia's heart ache. "I never knew I could feel like this," Xander said one evening as he held Thomas, the baby finally asleep after a fussy day. "Like my heart is walking around outside my body." "I know exactly what you mean," Julia said. She was finally feeling more like herself, the exhaustion of early motherhood easing as Thomas began sleeping for longer stretches at night. "You want more?" Xander asked. "More children, I mean." Eventually, Julia thought about it. The birth had been difficult and the early weeks had been challenging. But looking at Thomas, at the perfect little person they had created, she found she did want more. "Yes," she said. "Maybe 2 or 3 more. I do not want Thomas to be an only child." "But not right away. Let us enjoy him for a while first." "Agreed," Xander said. Though I have to say I quite enjoyed the making of him. We could practice for the next one. Xander Jameson. Julia tried to sound scandalized but was betrayed by her laughter. What? I am just saying. I know what you are saying. And I am saying we need to wait a bit longer before we even think about that. But when Thomas was 6 months old and sleeping through most nights, when Julia had fully recovered and was starting to think about returning to her work with Dr. Hendricks part-time, she found herself drawn to Xander in a way she had not been since before the pregnancy. And one spring evening, with Thomas asleep in his cradle in the next room, they came together as husband and wife again, relearning each other, celebrating the life they had built. I love you, Julia whispered afterward, curled against Xander's chest. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I love you too, Xander said, his fingers running through her hair. You healed more than just my wound all those years ago, Julia. You healed my loneliness, my wandering, my belief that I would never belong anywhere. You gave me a home. You gave me one too, Julia said. And not just this ranch, this house. You gave me a home in yourself, a place where I could be exactly who I am without apology. They lay together in the quiet, listening to the sound of the creek outside and Thomas's soft breathing from the next room, and Julia thought about the chain of events that had led them here. A gunshot, a chance encounter, a choice to save a stranger's life. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in San Pedro, running from heartbreak and afraid to trust again. She thought about that first meeting in the dusty street, blood on her hands and a stranger's green eyes looking up at her with pain and something else, something that had called to her even then. What are you thinking about? Xander asked, his voice drowsy. About how far we have come. About how a bullet brought us together. I am glad I was shot, Xander said, then laughed. That is a strange thing to say, is it not? Very strange, but I understand what you mean. She propped herself up to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. If you had not been hurt, if I had not run into the street to help you, we might never have met. Or if we had, it would have been different, just two strangers passing. I do not believe that, Xander said, pulling her down for a kiss. I think we would have found each other somehow. Some people are meant to meet, meant to be together. We were always going to find our way to each other. You are a romantic, Julia teased. I am, he agreed without shame. And you love me for it. I do, she said, and kissed him again. By the time Thomas was a year old, walking and getting into everything, Julia had returned to working with Dr. Hendricks 1 day a week. It was not as much as she had done before, but it was enough to satisfy her need to practice medicine while still being present for her son. Xander's horse training business had grown, and they were making enough money to hire more help around the ranch. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm, and Julia was content in a way she had never been in Philadelphia. This was real, this life of hard work and simple pleasures, of watching her son grow and working alongside her husband to build something lasting. They added to their family in 1882. When Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose. This birth was easier than the first, perhaps because Julia knew what to expect, or perhaps because Dr. Hendricks was there to help from the beginning. Sarah had Julia's blonde hair and Xander's green eyes, and Thomas was immediately fascinated by his baby sister. Gentle, Julia would remind him as he tried to touch Sarah's tiny hands and feet. She is very small. 2 years later, another son arrived, Matthew James Jameson. By this point, Julia and Xander were old hands at parenthood, managing the chaos of 3 children with surprising grace. The cabin had been expanded twice, and they now had a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and even a room Julia used as a clinic where she could see patients who could not make it into town. Word had spread about her skills, and people began seeking her out specifically. She handled everything from minor injuries to difficult births, always with Xander's support. He would watch the children when she needed to focus on a patient, would ride to fetch supplies from town, would simply be there as a sounding board when she needed to talk through a difficult case. "You are an amazing doctor," Xander told her one evening after she had successfully set a broken arm for a ranch hand who had been thrown from a horse. "You know that, right?" "I am not a doctor," Julia corrected automatically. "I never had formal training." "You are more skilled than half the doctors I have met. Training is not everything. You have instinct and experience and a gift for healing. That makes you a doctor in my book." Julia smiled at him, grateful for his support. There were still those who dismissed her, because she was a woman, who refused to be treated by her and insisted on waiting for Dr. Hendricks. But there were many more who trusted her, who brought their children to her when they were sick, who called on her in emergencies. The years passed in a pleasant blur of work and family, of watching their children grow and their ranch prosper. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved working with the animals. Sarah was bright and curious, always asking questions about everything. Matthew was the daredevil of the family, constantly climbing things he should not and jumping off things that were far too high. "He is going to give me gray hair," Julia said, watching Matthew scale a fence that was definitely not meant for climbing. "He is spirited," Xander said diplomatically. "He is reckless. Matthew James, you get down from there right now." By 1890, Thomas was 10, Sarah was 8, and Matthew was 6. The children were thriving, and Julia and Xander had built a life that exceeded even their early dreams. The ranch was successful, their house was full of laughter, and they were still deeply in love. One evening, after the children were in bed, Julia and Xander sat on their porch, watching the stars come out over the hills. This had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day, a chance to reconnect as husband and wife rather than just parents and business partners. "You ever think about that day?" Xander asked, his arm around her shoulders. "The day we met." "Often," Julia admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I had not run out into that street, if I had been too afraid or too proper or too anything. I think about the man who shot me," Xander said. "I have never told you this, but I saw him again once, about 5 years ago. He was in town at the general store, still had my paint mare." Julia sat up straight, staring at him. "You never said anything. Did you report him to the sheriff?" "No, I just looked at him and he looked at me and I realized I did not care anymore. Yes, he stole my horse. Yes, he shot me. But if he had not, I might have gone on that cattle drive. I might have drifted on to the next town and the next job, never putting down roots. I certainly would not have spent weeks recovering in a doctor's office, falling in love with the most incredible woman I have ever known." "So you let him go, just like that?" "I let it go," Xander corrected. "The anger, the need for revenge, all of it. Because that man, for all the wrong he did, inadvertently gave me the greatest gift of my life. He gave me you." Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. After 12 years of marriage, Xander could still say things that made her heart race. "You healed more than just your wounds," she whispered, echoing words from long ago. "You healed my heart when I thought it was too broken to love again. And you healed mine," Xander said, pulling her close. "You gave me a home, a family, a reason to stop running. You gave me everything." They sat together in the comfortable silence of long companionship, listening to the night sounds of their ranch. The gentle lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote. Inside the house, their children slept safely, and all around them was the evidence of the life they had built together through love and hard work and unwavering commitment. "No regrets?" Julia asked, a question she asked every year on their anniversary. Not a single one, Xander answered as he always did. You, not one, Julia confirmed. Though I do think we should have one more child. Xander pulled back to look at her in surprise. Really, I thought we were done. I thought so too. But lately I have been thinking about it, and I would like one more. One more chance to watch a new little person grow, one more baby to hold. What do you think? I think, Xander said slowly, a smile spreading across his face, that I would love nothing more than to have another child with you. Though I warn you, between the two of us, we seem to make children who are either too serious or too reckless. I'm not sure we can handle another Matthew, Julia laughed. Whatever we get, we will manage, we always do. Their fourth and final child, a daughter named Elizabeth Grace, was born in the spring of 1891. At 35, Julia found this pregnancy more tiring than the previous ones, and the birth was longer and more difficult. But when she held Elizabeth for the first time, looking down at the tiny face so like her own, she knew this was meant to be their last child, the completion of their family. The older children adored their baby sister. Thomas, now 11 and very responsible, would rock her cradle when she fussed. Sarah loved to help dress her and sing to her. Even Matthew was gentle with Elizabeth, his reckless energy calming in her presence. Our family is complete, Julia said one evening, watching Xander hold Elizabeth while the older children played nearby. This is everything I ever wanted and so much more than I ever dared to dream. I know what you mean, Xander said, looking around at their children, at the house they had built, at the life they had created. When I was drifting from town to town, I used to lie awake at night and try to imagine what it would feel like to have a home. I could never quite picture it. But this, right here, this is better than anything I could have imagined. As the years continued to pass, their children grew and flourished. Thomas developed a talent for working with horses that rivaled his father's. Sarah showed an aptitude for medicine and would often assist Julia when she was treating patients. Matthew's reckless energy was channeled into hard work on the ranch, and he became an excellent cattleman. Elizabeth was the youngest and perhaps the most spoiled, but she had a kind heart and a quick mind. In 1895, when Dr. Hendricks retired at the age of 72, he asked Julia to take over his practice. "You are the best medical practitioner in this part of California," he said. "Man or woman, trained or not, you are simply the best. These people need you." It was a huge responsibility, and Julia spent several days thinking about it before she accepted. With Xander's support and the help of their older children, she took over the practice, officially becoming the town's doctor even if she could never use that title legally without formal medical training. Dr. Julia, the townspeople called her, and she did not correct them. She had earned the title through years of hard work and successful treatments, even if no medical school would ever grant her a degree. Xander was proud of her, never once jealous or resentful of her success. He ran the ranch with help from Thomas and Matthew, and their operation had grown to include not just cattle, but a successful horse breeding and training business. They were comfortable now, not wealthy but secure, with enough money to send their children to good schools and even put some aside for the future. On their 20th anniversary in 1899, Julia and Xander traveled to San Francisco for a week, leaving the children in the care of Thomas, who at 19 was more than capable of managing both his siblings and the ranch. It was the first time they had been truly alone together since before Thomas was born, and they reveled in it. They walked along the docks, visited museums, ate in restaurants where someone else did the cooking. But mostly, they just enjoyed being together without the constant demands of children and work and responsibility. "You remember our wedding night?" Xander asked as they stood on a pier watching the sunset over the ocean. How we laughed and said we could not believe we had actually done it. I remember, Julia said, leaning into his warmth. We were so young, so certain and so uncertain at the same time. I am still certain, Xander said. 20 years later, I am more certain than ever that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Even when I am stubborn and insist on working too hard. Especially then. Your passion for your work is one of the things I love most about you. You have never been content to be anything less than fully yourself, and you have never asked me to be anything but who I am. Julia turned to face him fully. You know what I realized recently? That bullet that brought us together, that moment in the street when I ran to help you, that was not the beginning of our story. It was the middle. The beginning was every choice we made before that moment that put us on paths that would intersect. My choice to leave Philadelphia, your choice to come to San Pedro, 1,000 small decisions that led us both to that exact place at that exact time. And the end? Xander asked, pulling her close. There is no end, Julia said firmly. Not as long as we are both breathing. This story keeps going, keeps growing, keeps becoming something new and wonderful. They kissed there on the pier as the sun set over the Pacific. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and love. When they returned home, they found the ranch running smoothly, and the children eager to show them everything that had happened in their absence. Thomas had successfully trained a particularly difficult horse. Sarah had handled a medical emergency in town, treating a man who had cut his leg badly on a saw. Matthew had fixed a section of fence that had been broken for months. Elizabeth had made them a welcome home banner that was slightly crooked but heartfelt. We missed you, Elizabeth said, throwing her arms around Julia. At 8 years old, she was still young enough to be openly affectionate. We missed you too, sweetheart, Julia said, hugging her tight. But it was good for your father and me to have some time together. Life continued in its pleasant rhythm. Thomas married in 1902, a sweet girl named Margaret from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the property, Thomas having decided he wanted to stay and work the family ranch rather than strike out on his own. Julia and Xander became grandparents when Thomas and Margaret had a son in 1903. I cannot believe I am old enough to be a grandmother, Julia said, holding her grandson for the first time. When did that happen? When you were busy living your life, Xander said, his arm around her waist as they looked down at the baby. But if it helps, you are the most beautiful grandmother I have ever seen. Sarah went away to nursing school in San Francisco, one of the first women admitted to the program, and Julia was immensely proud. When Sarah graduated and returned to San Pedro to work alongside her mother, Julia felt a deep satisfaction. Her daughter was carrying on her work, her passion for healing passed down to the next generation. Matthew married in 1905 and moved to a ranch further north, where he would manage cattle operations. Elizabeth showed signs of wanting to follow in Sarah's footsteps, already helping in the clinic when she could. As Julia and Xander moved into their 40s and then their 50s, they found themselves with more time together than they had had in years. The children were grown, the ranch largely ran itself with Thomas's help, and Sarah had taken over most of the day-to-day medical work in town. They spent their time traveling occasionally, visiting Matthew at his ranch, spoiling their growing number of grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They would ride out to their favorite spot overlooking the ocean and sit for hours, talking and remembering and planning for the future. You ever wish you had done things differently? Julia asked one afternoon. They were in their mid-50s now, their hair graying but their love as strong as ever. That you had taken a different path? Never, Xander said without hesitation. Every choice I made, every turn in the road led me to you. How could I wish any of it different? I feel the same way, Julia said. Even the painful parts, the heartbreak in Philadelphia, the fear and uncertainty, it all led me here to this life to you. I would not change a single thing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Gulls wheeled overhead and the wind carried the scent of salt and sage. You know what I think about sometimes, Xander said. That man who shot me, I wonder if he ever knew what he set in motion. How one moment of violence, one act of theft led to all of this. He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the land around them but everything, their marriage, their children, their life together. I doubt he thinks about it at all, Julia said. But I do. I think about how life is a series of small moments that become large stories. That bullet brought you into my life, but it was all the moments after, all the choices we made together that built our story. A good story, Xander said, taking her hand. The best story, Julia agreed. In 1910, on their 31st anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. All 4 children were there with their families, along with what felt like half the town of San Pedro. There were speeches and toasts, and Julia found herself crying happy tears as she looked around at the community they had built, the family they had raised, the life they had created. I want to say something, Xander announced, standing and calling for quiet. When everyone was listening, he pulled Julia to her feet beside him. 31 years ago, I was shot in the street not far from here. I thought I was dying. But then this woman ran to help me, this stubborn, practical, beautiful woman who refused to let me give up. She saved my life that day, but that was just the beginning. Every day since, she has saved me in 1,000 small ways. She has been my partner, my love, my home. Julia, you healed more than just my wounds all those years ago. You healed my broken spirit and gave me a reason to live and a family to love. I am the luckiest man alive because I got to spend these 31 years with you, and I look forward to however many more we have together. There was not a dry eye in the room when he finished, and Julia pulled him down for a kiss, not caring that everyone was watching. I love you, she whispered against his lips. Forever. Forever, he echoed. As they moved into their 60s, Julia and Xander slowed down but never stopped. They were grandparents many times over now, and their children were building successful lives of their own. The ranch had been turned over to Thomas completely, though Xander still helped out when he felt like it. Sarah was running the medical practice, with Elizabeth as her assistant. Matthew's ranch was thriving, and he had become something of a cattle baron in his region. But for Julia and Xander, the greatest joy was still each other. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, hands clasped, watching the sunset just as they had done for decades. They would talk about their day, their children, their grandchildren, but mostly they would just be together, comfortable in the silence that only comes from a lifetime of companionship. Do you remember, Julia said one evening when they were both 66, when you told me you loved me for the first time? We were sitting on a hillside overlooking the ocean, and you said you had never been more certain of anything. I remember, Xander said, and I was right. I have never doubted it for a single moment in all these years. Neither have I, Julia said. Even in the hard times, the moments when we fought or when things were difficult, I never doubted that I loved you and that you loved me. That certainty has been the foundation of everything. It still is, Xander said, squeezing her hand. They lived to see the 20th century fully established, saw automobiles become common and electricity reach even rural areas like their ranch. They saw their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own, making Julia and Xander great-grandparents. We have built quite a legacy, Julia said one day, looking at a family photograph that included 4 generations. "Look at all these people who exist because we met in a dusty street in 1878. Because you saved my life," Xander corrected. "Because we saved each other," Julia said. "That is what love is, I think. Mutual salvation. We each gave the other what they needed to become whole." Xander died peacefully in his sleep in 1925, at the age of 70. Julia woke one morning to find him beside her, looking peaceful, his hand still clasped in hers. She knew immediately that he was gone, and the grief was like a physical blow. After 46 years together, losing him felt like losing a part of herself. But even in her grief, Julia found comfort in the life they had built together. She was surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them offering support and love. And she had her memories, decades of beautiful memories to sustain her. She lived for another 5 years, spending her time with family, still occasionally helping with medical issues despite her age, and often sitting on the porch looking out over the land she and Xander had worked together. Sometimes she would close her eyes and still feel his hand in hers, still hear his voice telling her he loved her. On a warm afternoon in October of 1930, Julia Jameson passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 74. She was buried next to Xander on the hillside overlooking the ocean, the spot where he had first told her he loved her so many decades before. At her funeral, Sarah spoke about her mother's legacy, about the hundreds of people Julia had helped over her lifetime, about the way she had broken barriers as one of the first female medical practitioners in the region. Thomas spoke about the ranch and the family business she and Xander had built from nothing. Matthew talked about her strength and determination. Elizabeth simply said that Julia had been the best mother anyone could ask for, someone who had shown by example that women could be anything they chose to be. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from one of Julia's great-grandchildren, who had found an old letter Xander had written to Julia on their 25th anniversary. The child read it aloud, Xander's words echoing across the decades. "My dearest Julia, 25 years ago today, you became my wife. But the truth is you became my everything long before that. You became my everything the moment I opened my eyes in a dusty street and saw you kneeling beside me, determination and compassion in your eyes. You healed more than just my wounds that day. You healed my loneliness, my aimlessness, my belief that I would never belong anywhere or to anyone. You gave me a home, not just in a place but in your heart. Every day with you has been a gift, and I look forward to spending the rest of my life showing you how much I love you. Forever yours, Xander." There was not a dry eye among the gathered family and friends. Julia and Xander's love story had become legendary in San Pedro, told and retold as an example of what love could be when two people committed fully to each other and to building a life together. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations, and the house Julia and Xander had built was carefully maintained, becoming something of a family shrine. The clinic in town where Julia had practiced medicine was eventually named in her honor, and her contributions to medicine in California were recognized with a plaque that hung in the building for decades. But more than the buildings or the accolades, Julia and Xander's true legacy was the family they had created, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their values of hard work, compassion, and love. Their story of a chance meeting in a street, of love born from a moment of crisis, of a life built on mutual respect and unwavering commitment, became a family legend, told to each new generation as a reminder of where they came from, and what was possible when two people found each other against all odds. And on warm October evenings, when the wind blew just right across the California hills. Some family members swore they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, hand in hand, watching the sunset over the ocean together. Whether it was real or simply the power of a love story so strong it transcended death, no one could say for certain. But it brought comfort to believe that Julia and Xander were still together somewhere, still healing each other's wounds, still building there forever. The end.